The sound that destroys a lifetime does not always come with a warning. The growl of a diesel engine rolled across the orchard before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. At first, I thought it was a delivery truck taking the county road behind my property. Then I heard the second sound, a deep mechanical crunch followed by the sharp crack of wood under pressure. My eyes snapped open. The air coming through my bedroom window carried the smell of fresh dirt and crushed leaves. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I pulled on my boots and stepped onto the porch just as the first rays of orange sunlight spilled across the rows of apple trees. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. A yellow bulldozer sat in the middle of my orchard. Another machine idled nearby, its engine rumbling low like distant thunder. Branches lay scattered across the grass. Leaves drifted through the morning air. One of my oldest apple trees was gone. Completely gone. My name is Caleb Whitaker, and that orchard had been part of my family longer than I had been alive. My grandfather planted the first trees there nearly 60 years ago. Every spring the blossoms turned the hillside white. Every fall the scent of ripe apples drifted across the valley. Some people saw trees. I saw birthdays, harvest festivals, family photographs, and generations of work. I ran down the gravel path toward the machines, my boots kicking up dust. The smell of diesel fuel grew stronger with every step. Workers stood near stacks of orange survey markers while a woman in a bright HOA windbreaker studied a set of plans clipped to a board. Diane Mercer, HOA president. She did not look surprised to see me. In fact, she looked pleased. "Good morning, Caleb," she called out with a smile that immediately raised my blood pressure. "What exactly is happening here?" I demanded. Diane glanced toward the orchard like she was admiring a landscaping project. "Community Improvement Initiative," she said. "The board approved a new walking trail and recreation area." I stared at her. Then I stared at the bulldozer. Then back at her. "This is private property." Her smile never moved. "According to our development plan, this section was identified as suitable for community enhancement." Community enhancement. I looked past her shoulder. Another tree disappeared from the row. Leaves fluttered across the grass. The morning sunlight illuminated floating dust where branches had stood for decades. Several neighbors watched from a distance, coffee cups in hand, as though this were some scheduled event. That was the moment I realized Diane genuinely believed she was in charge. She thought paperwork from the HOA gave her authority over land she had never owned. She thought this orchard was simply an obstacle standing in the way of her vision. What she did not know was that the orchard was far more than a collection of apple trees. Hidden inside county records, environmental surveys, and conservation documents was a designation so powerful that even government agencies treated it carefully. As another machine rolled deeper into the orchard, Diane stood there smiling at what she thought was the beginning of her project. She had no idea she was actually creating the biggest mistake of her entire career. For several seconds, I just stood there staring at the empty space where that tree had been. The smell of crushed apples hung in the cool morning air. Pieces of leaves drifted across the grass like green confetti nobody wanted. The orchard stretched across nearly 20 acres behind my house, row after row of carefully maintained trees following the gentle slope of the hillside. Most people saw a business. My family saw history. My grandfather planted the first trees after returning from the Korean War. He spent years turning rough farmland into something productive. My father expanded it. I inherited it. Every tree had a story attached to it. I could walk through those rows and tell you which section survived a drought in the 1980s, which trees produced the best harvest during unusually cold seasons, and which corner of the orchard my father always inspected first every spring. Diane did not see any of that. To her, it was an undeveloped space sitting next to a growing neighborhood. I watched workers move orange survey flags deeper into the property while another machine rolled slowly forward. The low rumble of engines echoed across the valley. Birds lifted from nearby branches and disappeared toward the woods. "You cannot do this," I said. Diane adjusted her sunglasses and glanced down at her clipboard. "The board voted unanimously," she replied. "The community wants more recreational space." Community. That word again. The HOA had been using it constantly during the previous year. Community enhancement. Community development. Community access. Every proposal sounded reasonable when presented in a meeting room with charts and smiling presentations. What nobody mentioned was that each project seemed to require more control over property that did not belong to them. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Diane noticed immediately. Her smile tightened slightly, but she did not stop the work. If anything, she seemed more determined. That confidence bothered me. It meant she believed she had already won. A few neighbors gathered along the roadside. Some looked uncomfortable. Others appeared excited about the planned walking trail. One man even pointed toward the orchard while discussing future picnic areas. Listening to them felt surreal. They were planning activities in a place that still belonged to someone else. The rising sun painted the orchard gold while dust floated through the light. Normally, it was one of my favorite views in the world. That morning it felt different. Then something caught my attention. Near the southern edge of the property stood a small wooden marker mounted beside an old fence line. Most people never noticed it. The sign was weathered from years of rain and sunlight. From where I stood, I could barely read the faded lettering. But I knew exactly what it said. Protected Habitat Boundary. Suddenly, I was no longer angry. I was curious. Because if Diane had reviewed every document she claimed to have reviewed, she should have known that marker existed. She should have known why it was there. She should have known what the orchard had been registered as years earlier. Yet the machines kept moving. The workers kept following instructions. And Diane kept smiling, watching her stand there beneath the morning sunlight, completely convinced she understood the land better than the people who had cared for it for decades. I realized something important. She had done research on development plans. I had something far more powerful. I had the original records. The strange thing about power is that it rarely arrives all at once. It grows quietly. One rule, one committee, one approval at a time. Looking back, Diane's obsession with the orchard had started almost 2 years earlier. At first it seemed harmless. During HOA meetings, she would point toward my property and talk about opportunities. The orchard was too natural, she said, too underutilized, too isolated from the rest of the neighborhood. She wanted connectivity, accessibility, community engagement. Every phrase sounded polished enough to fit inside a brochure. Most residents nodded along because they never saw what I saw. They saw rows of trees. I saw a living ecosystem. Diane first proposed a walking trail that would run along the edge of the property. Then she suggested a small observation area overlooking the hillside. After that came plans for seasonal events, outdoor gatherings, and community recreation space. Each proposal reached a little farther into land that did not belong to the HOA. Every time I pushed back, Diane responded with the same confident smile. She acted as though resistance was simply a temporary inconvenience standing in the way of progress. By the following spring, her language became more aggressive. She stopped referring to the orchard as private agricultural property. Instead, she called it a community asset. Hearing those words during a board meeting nearly made me laugh. Community asset. The orchard had existed decades before the first subdivision appeared. Yet somehow the narrative was changing. New residents moved into the neighborhood and assumed the HOA had authority over everything they could see from their back porches. Diane encouraged that assumption without ever stating it directly. That was what made her effective. She never claimed ownership. She simply behaved as though ownership was obvious. One afternoon, I attended a planning presentation at the clubhouse. The room smelled like fresh coffee and new carpet. Architectural renderings covered the walls. Residents wandered between displays discussing future improvements. Then I saw it. A large color map mounted on an easel. The orchard appeared right in the center. Walking paths curved through rows of trees. Picnic areas occupied open sections of land. Decorative lighting lined pathways that did not exist. Families smiled from artist renderings showing activities on property the HOA had never controlled. Diane stood nearby answering questions. She looked proud. When someone asked whether the landowner supported the project, she glanced toward me and offered a careful response. We are working through administrative details. Administrative details. That was apparently what 60 years of private ownership had become. Several people turned and smiled at me, assuming I was already involved. I smiled back without correcting them. The more Diane talked, the more I realized something important. She genuinely believed the orchard would eventually become part of her project. She had invested too much time, too much political capital, and too much confidence to imagine any other outcome. Standing there beneath bright clubhouse lights while residents admired future plans, I noticed something else. Not one display mentioned conservation restrictions. Not one map referenced habitat boundaries. Not one proposal acknowledged environmental registration records. Diane had built an entire vision around a piece of land she clearly did not fully understand. And the larger her plans became, the more expensive that misunderstanding was about to get. The morning the machines arrived should not have surprised me. Looking back, all the warning signs had been there. Diane had spent months building support for her project. Newsletters appeared in mailboxes. HOA emails praised future recreational opportunities. Community surveys asked carefully worded questions designed to produce predictable answers. Every step pushed the idea forward. By the time the bulldozers rolled onto the property, many residents already believed construction was inevitable. That was the real power of assumptions. People stop asking whether something is allowed and start asking when it will begin. Standing near the orchard that morning, I watched workers unload equipment while sunlight slowly spread across the hillside. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with crushed grass and damp soil. Engines idled. Backup alarms echoed through the valley. A few contractors studied maps attached to clipboards. None of them looked malicious. Most appeared to believe they were participating in a routine improvement project. Diane moved between them confidently, pointing toward different sections of the orchard. She looked like a developer unveiling a completed vision rather than someone entering private property. What struck me most was how organized everything seemed. Temporary fencing had been delivered. Survey markers lined portions of the hillside. Construction schedules were posted inside plastic sleeves. Someone had clearly spent months preparing. Yet nobody had contacted me for final authorization. Nobody had requested access agreements. Nobody had asked about conservation records. The project had been planned around the assumption that ownership questions no longer mattered. Around mid-morning, I returned to the house and reviewed every communication I had received during the previous year. The stack filled half my dining room table. HOA notices, meeting agendas, community development updates, budget projections. As I worked through the paperwork, a pattern emerged. The language had gradually shifted from possibility to certainty. Early documents discussed potential improvements. Later documents described approved improvements. Eventually, the project stopped being presented as a proposal at all. It became a future fact. The orchard was simply expected to cooperate. That afternoon, I attended an emergency HOA meeting called to celebrate the first phase of development. The clubhouse buzzed with excitement. Coffee machines hissed in the corner. Residents chatted about walking trails and outdoor events. Diane stood at the front of the room beside large display boards showing future plans. Applause followed nearly every update she delivered. Watching the presentation felt surreal. The actual orchard still existed outside. The smell of apples still drifted through the open windows. Yet inside that room, people spoke about the land as though transformation had already been completed. Then Diane announced that additional work would continue throughout the week. More clearing, more preparation, more construction planning. The room applauded again. I remained silent. Not because I lacked evidence. Not because I lacked options. Because something about the situation had started to interest me. The deeper Diane committed herself to the project, the more documentation she created. Every meeting generated records. Every vote generated minutes. Every approval generated signatures. She believed those documents strengthened her position. In reality, they were building a timeline. And timelines have a habit of becoming very important when people finally start reading the right records. The next few days were some of the strangest of my life. From the outside, it probably looked like I had given up. The machines continued appearing at the edge of the property. Workers measured sections of land. HOA updates celebrated progress. Diane walked through the neighborhood with the confidence of someone whose plans were unfolding exactly as expected. Meanwhile, I spent my mornings in a very different place. The county records office, the conservation district headquarters, environmental planning departments. Every building smelled like paper, coffee, and old filing cabinets. Every conversation added another piece to a puzzle that was becoming larger than I originally imagined. I requested copies of surveys dating back more than a decade, wildlife assessments, habitat registration records, conservation correspondence. The deeper I dug, the more remarkable the orchard's history became. Years earlier, a regional environmental study had identified portions of the property as supporting protected habitat activity. Additional evaluations followed. Conservation recommendations were filed. Eventually, the orchard received a formal registration status connected to habitat preservation efforts recognized by county authorities. Most people never knew because nothing about the registration changed daily life. I still harvested apples. Families still visited during the fall season. The trees still bloomed every spring. The difference existed on paper. And sometimes paper changes everything. One afternoon, I spread dozens of documents across my kitchen table. Sunlight streamed through the windows while the scent of fresh apples lingered from a nearby storage room. Every record pointed in the same direction. Habitat boundaries, environmental protections, notification requirements, review procedures, approval processes. Reading through them felt less like discovering a secret and more like rediscovering something that had been patiently waiting for someone to pay attention. Then I found the document that stopped me cold. It was a conservation review summary attached to a previous land use request from years earlier. The language was clear. Any significant alteration affecting designated areas required formal review before work could proceed. I read the paragraph 3 times, then a fourth. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, a breeze moved through the remaining orchard rows, rustling leaves against one another with a soft, whispering sound. Diane had spent months collecting HOA approvals. Committees had voted. Contractors had been hired. Plans had been drawn. Yet none of the records in front of me suggested those approvals were the ones that mattered most. That realization changed my entire strategy. Up until then, I had been focused on what had already happened. Now I started focusing on what could be proven. So I organized everything. Photographs, meeting minutes, project announcements, construction schedules, emails, survey maps, habitat records. By the end of the week, my dining room looked like a temporary research center. Every document connected to another. Every date supported a timeline. Every timeline told the same story. Diane believed she had built a case for development. In reality, she had created a paper trail. And with every newsletter, every meeting, and every signed approval, that trail became easier to follow. Sitting there as evenings settled across the orchard, listening to crickets emerge from the grass, while golden sunlight faded beyond the hills, I realized something important. Diane thought the project was nearing completion. The truth was that the real story had only just begun. By the second week, I stopped thinking of the orchard as the center of the story. The orchard was only the trigger. The real story lived inside the records. Every morning, I added another document to the growing stack on my dining room table. Habitat maps, environmental correspondence, review requirements, county acknowledgments. The pile grew high enough that sunlight coming through the windows cast long shadows across the pages. Outside, autumn was beginning to settle over the valley. The remaining apple trees carried hints of gold and red. Cool air drifted through the orchard at sunrise. Birds still moved through the branches. Nature continued following its routine, completely unaware of the arguments humans were having about paperwork. Then I received a phone call that changed everything. The caller worked for a regional conservation office. We had exchanged emails earlier in the week after I submitted copies of several records. His voice remained calm throughout the conversation, but I noticed something interesting. He kept asking for dates, exact dates, construction schedules, meeting approvals, public announcements. Every question focused on timing. When the call ended, I spent several hours organizing a complete timeline. The result was remarkable. Diane had documented nearly every major decision herself. HOA newsletters announced project milestones. Meeting minutes recorded votes. Public presentations described future construction. Social media posts celebrated progress. The more I organized the information, the clearer the pattern became. Nobody had hidden anything. In fact, they had shared everything proudly. That transparency turned out to be incredibly valuable. A few days later, I attended another community meeting. The atmosphere felt almost festive. The clubhouse smelled like coffee and cinnamon pastries. Residents chatted about future walking paths and seasonal events. Large display boards showed artist renderings of what the property might eventually become. Diane stood near the front greeting homeowners. She looked completely relaxed, confident, comfortable. Watching her interact with residents, I realized she still believed this was a simple property dispute. She thought I was defending trees. She had no idea the conversation had already moved beyond land use and into environmental review territory. During the meeting, She announced additional planning efforts and thanked volunteers who had supported the project. Applause followed. People smiled. Some even discussed future community gatherings beneath decorative lights shown in the renderings. I remained silent in the back row, not because I lacked a response, because every new announcement created another record. Every public statement added another entry to the timeline. Every celebration strengthened documentation that already existed. When the meeting ended, I stepped outside into the cool evening air. The scent of fallen leaves drifted across the parking lot. Across the road, the orchard sat beneath a fading orange sky. The remaining rows looked peaceful despite everything that had happened. As I stood there, my phone vibrated. Another email had arrived from the conservation office. This time it contained a formal request for additional documentation and confirmation of specific project activities. Reading it, I felt the first hint that outside agencies were beginning to pay attention. Diane believed she was nearing the finish line. In reality, a completely different process had just begun. And unlike HOA meetings, this one would be guided by records, timelines, and regulations that nobody could vote away. The first official inquiry arrived on a Tuesday morning. I was standing near the packing shed sorting late-season apples when an email notification appeared on my phone. The air smelled like fresh fruit and damp grass. A light breeze moved through the remaining rows, carrying the familiar rustling sound of leaves brushing against one another. For the first time in weeks, I felt something shift. The message was not dramatic. It did not contain accusations or conclusions. It simply confirmed that environmental reviewers had opened a formal examination of the available records. That was all. Just a process beginning exactly the way processes are supposed to begin. Quietly, methodically, based on documentation. I read the email twice before slipping the phone back into my pocket. Across the orchard, sunlight filtered through branches that had survived decades of storms, droughts, and changing seasons. Those trees had seen more history than most people living in the neighborhood. They had outlasted economic downturns, ownership transitions, and development booms. Suddenly, I realized they might outlast this situation too. Over the following days, requests for information increased. Conservation officials wanted photographs. County representatives requested timelines. Additional records were reviewed. Every document I submitted matched another document already sitting in an archive somewhere. That consistency mattered. Facts are strongest when they do not depend on memory. Meanwhile, Diane continued moving forward as though nothing had changed. HOA newsletters still promoted future plans. Community discussions still focused on walking trails and event spaces. Residents continued assuming the project would eventually resume. Most had no idea how many agencies were now examining the paperwork behind the scenes. One evening, I attended another HOA gathering. The clubhouse parking lot was full. Inside, people discussed landscaping concepts and future amenities. Diane stood at the front of the room, speaking confidently about long-term goals. Looking around, I noticed something interesting. She had stopped mentioning timelines. Earlier presentations focused heavily on schedules and progress. Now those details were becoming less specific. Questions from residents were answered with phrases like ongoing review and administrative coordination. The change was subtle, but it was there. Diane had finally realized that something outside the HOA's control was happening. After the meeting ended, several residents approached me in the parking lot. For the first time, they were asking questions instead of making assumptions. Some wanted to understand the history of the orchard. Others asked about conservation records they had never heard about before. I answered honestly. No speeches, no arguments, just facts. The more people learned, the more their confidence in the original narrative began to fade. That was the moment I understood the real strength of patience. If I had reacted emotionally on the first morning, the story would have become a personal dispute. Instead, it had become a question of records, timelines, and responsibilities. As October progressed, more requests arrived. More files were reviewed. More connections appeared. Every step seemed small by itself. Together, they were creating a complete picture. Diane thought she had spent months building support for a project. In reality, she had spent months documenting exactly how that project came to exist. And with every page that entered the review process, the trap she never knew existed was slowly closing around her own paperwork. The public review meeting took place on a gray November afternoon. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the county administration building while residents filled rows of chairs inside a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and wet jackets. By then, word had spread throughout the neighborhood that outside agencies were examining the project records. Nobody seemed entirely sure what that meant. Some expected a simple clarification. Others expected permits to be approved and construction to resume. Diane walked into the room carrying the same confidence she had displayed for months. But this time something felt different. The smile was still there. The posture was still polished. Yet there was a tension around her eyes that had not existed before. I took a seat near the back and placed a small folder on the table beside me. Most of the important documents were already in the hands of reviewers. My role that afternoon was simple. Listen. The meeting began with procedural updates. Representatives from environmental departments summarized timelines, reviewed submitted records, and explained the purpose of the ongoing examination. Everything sounded routine until the discussion reached the orchard. Suddenly the room became very quiet. A large map appeared on a screen at the front of the room. Habitat boundaries were highlighted. Conservation records were displayed. Historical registration documents followed. One by one, records that had existed quietly for years were placed into public view. Residents leaned forward in their seats. Several exchanged confused glances. Many were seeing the information for the first time. Diane sat motionless as reviewers walked through the timeline. Registration dates, survey findings, conservation correspondence, administrative requirements. Every document connected neatly to the next. The story told by the records was remarkably straightforward. The problem was that almost nobody had ever bothered reading them before. Questions followed. Had proper reviews been completed? Were all approvals obtained? Had required notifications been issued? The answers came directly from the documentation. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. Facts rarely need dramatic delivery. They simply exist. As the afternoon continued, the atmosphere inside the room changed. Earlier conversations had centered on future plans and community improvements. Now people were discussing responsibilities, procedures, and oversight. The difference was subtle but important. The project was no longer being viewed through the lens of ambition. It was being viewed through the lens of accountability. Looking around the room, I could almost see assumptions dissolving in real time. Homeowners who had supported the project were not angry. They were surprised. Many had trusted that all necessary steps had already been completed. Learning otherwise forced them to reevaluate everything they thought they knew. Near the end of the meeting, officials announced that additional review actions would continue and that project activities connected to the disputed area would remain under examination. The statement was professional and carefully worded, yet its impact was obvious. The room fell silent. Outside, rain continued sliding down the windows while the afternoon light faded into evening. As people gathered their belongings and slowly filed toward the exits, I noticed Diane staring at the display screen where the habitat boundary map still remained. For the first time since this entire situation began, she looked less like someone leading a project and more like someone realizing how much of the story she had never actually seen. And as the last residents left the room, it became clear that the future of the orchard would not be decided by assumptions, votes, or confidence. It would be decided by the records that had been there all along. Winter arrived slowly that year. The first frost settled across the orchard in late November, coating the grass with a thin layer of silver that sparkled beneath the morning sun. I stood near the hillside one quiet morning with my hands in my jacket pockets, breathing in the familiar scent of cold earth, apple wood, and fallen leaves. The machines were gone. The temporary fencing was gone. The survey markers had disappeared. For the first time in months, the property felt like itself again. The final review process continued through the end of the year, and when the conclusions were eventually released, they confirmed what the records had shown from the beginning. The designated habitat protections were valid. The required reviews had not been fully completed before project activities moved forward. Additional corrective measures were recommended. Future proposals involving the property would require proper coordination through established channels. Nothing about the outcome felt dramatic. There were no grand speeches, no theatrical confrontations, just facts finding their proper place. Around the neighborhood, attitudes began to change. Residents who once viewed the orchard as empty space started seeing it differently. Some asked questions about the conservation program. Others wanted to learn about the wildlife surveys and environmental history connected to the land. Several even volunteered to help with restoration efforts in areas that needed attention. The more people learned, the more they realized how much history had existed right in front of them. As for Diane, she gradually stepped away from the project that had consumed so much of her attention. The confidence that once filled every meeting was replaced by something quieter. Reflection, maybe. One afternoon, several months later, I saw her standing near the edge of the orchard looking across the rows of trees. The air carried the scent of early spring blossoms beginning to emerge. Neither of us said much. We did not need to. The documents had already finished the conversation for us. By April, new growth appeared everywhere. Fresh leaves unfolded from branches. Birds returned to familiar nesting areas. Bees drifted between blossoms under bright blue skies. Near the old fence line, I installed a new habitat marker to replace the weathered sign that had stood there for years. The lettering was clear and easy to read. Protected habitat. Simple words. Powerful words. Looking at that sign, I thought about my grandfather. He planted trees believing they would outlive him. My father cared for them believing they were worth protecting. Now it was my turn. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, golden light spilled across the orchard exactly the way it had when I was a child. The rows stretched into the distance. The breeze moved gently through the branches. Everything felt calm. That was when I finally understood the lesson hidden inside the entire ordeal. Diane thought she was changing a piece of land. What she really challenged was decades of history supported by records she never bothered to read. The orchard survived because truth does not depend on popularity. It depends on facts. And just like an apple tree, the strongest roots are usually the ones nobody notices until they try to remove them.